talk I'm giving today is the Borgmann project and describing it, which is a project to list all the words in the English language. The reason it's called the Borgmann project is in honor of Dmitri Alfred Borgmann, who has been called the father of logology, logology being the study of wordplay. Sometimes we call it recreational linguistics. As you know, of course, linguistics goes back for a couple hundred years, but wordplay goes back a lot further. Aristophanes coined a word for hash, which when transliterated to English comes out to 183 letters. So it's been around since the beginning of time. What the contribution that Borgmann made in a couple of seminal books and later in a journal was to try to systematize the study, try to come up with all words of a certain character and so on. And of course, foundational to that is what's a word? How many words are there in English? So in his book Beyond Language, Borgmann gave an estimate of between 2 and 3 million words in English. Now, that estimate is quite a bit larger than any existing list of words. So the question is, where did he get that estimate? Where did he come up with it? So here's a place to start. This is the preface to the Merriam-Webster's the New International Third Edition, and in which Gove, the editor at the time, notes that there's about 450,000 words in the book, in the dictionary, but that it would have been possible easily to expand the lexicon by many times. Here's a similar quote from the Oxford English Dictionary, in which it's noted that the lexicon, again, is much larger than can fit in the dictionary. And in fact, the last part of the preface is interesting, where he says that the question of how many words are there in the English language cannot be answered by recourse to a dictionary. So the question is, the purpose of the project is to try to answer that question and to come up with a list. So the first question you have to ask is, what is a word? Okay. So for the purposes of this discussion, I don't want to try to define a word. I'm just going to say a word is the smallest unit of meaning. It's analogous to a letter, which is the smallest unit of spelling, or a phoneme, the smallest unit of pronunciation. And if anyone has a question about what I mean by that, I'm not going to get into some cycle of trying to define things. That's as much as I'm going to say about what a word is. Okay. So current unabridged dictionaries, if you combine together all of their entries, you get about 500,000 words. So if we accept Gove's estimate that it would have been possible to have many times that many in the dictionary, and if many times means 4 to 6, then we do get a number somewhere around Borgmann's estimate of 2 to 3 million. It's important to point out, by the way, we're not just saying it's some big number. We're not saying it's 4 million, and we're not saying it's 1 million. Borgmann said 2 to 3 million. And that, I think, turns out to be a pretty good estimate, and part of the content today will be to back that estimate up numerically. So the question is, how do we find those words? Well, let me go through some of the problems in isolating this list. The first is the problem of names. A name is a word. It designates either an individual or a class of individuals, and there seems to be essentially an unlimited number of names. So how can we say that there's 2 to 3 million words in English if essentially names can be generated at will? We also have a problem of prefixes and suffixes. We can take a word like countermeasures and add countermeasures and countermeasures and so on ad infinitum and generate infinitely many words, all of which have distinct meanings. Again, so how do we say there's a finite number of words? Another problem is English is very loose with closing open compounds. There's an example I pick up is air vent and air hyphen vent and air space vent. So in this room, there's an air vent. It's not a word that is rare or unusual. It's just a word that's sometimes spelled open and sometimes spelled closed. And there's an awful lot of examples like that. Then there's the problem of derived forms. We have the verb Shanghai, and we have the participle of Shanghaiing, which can be converted to a noun, Shanghaiing, and then pluralized, Shanghaiing. The reason that's interesting to do that is, to a logologist, is because that word has exactly 2 copies of every letter that's in it. So we want to know whether that is a legitimate word. We also have the problem of rare words. Specifically, we have a lot of different dialects. We have obsolete words. Where do we draw a cutoff? We have jargon, slang, technical terms, loan words from other languages. I mean, what is the English language? It's a very fuzzy demarcation. So I'm going to give you an example of a rare word that we want to include in the language. And the word is amitular. The reason we want that word included is because it's constantly coined. It's a word that needs to exist. It wants to exist. It's incorrectly coined in the sense that it's not correct Latin in the way in which it's created, but that doesn't really matter. Words get created all kinds of ways. In this case, it's a parallel word to its sort of semantic cousin of avuncular. So that word shows up in many reference works. As I said, it's been coined independently many times, but I just want you to remember that word. We're going to come back to it. That's an example of a word that we want to be able to say, yes, that word's in English. So how do we solve all these problems? Well, the first question is, I said I wasn't going to talk too much about what a word is, but I am going to talk about a thing called the paradox of the heap. The paradox of the heap is a very old paradox. It dates back to the sophists and beyond. And the paradox goes like this. Everyone agrees that 1 grain of wheat is not a heap. And everyone agrees that if you have something that is not a heap and you add 1 grain to it, also that's not a heap. So logically, no matter how many grains of wheat you have in a pile, you don't have a heap. So there's something wrong with that argument. Clearly, that argument is incorrect because we all know what a heap is, and we freely identify heaps of wheat and other things all the time. So the problem is with a concept called vague terms, which is now a very much studied problem in philosophy of how do we identify what is true, when can you apply a term to an object and when can't you? And the secret to solving the problem of vagueness is probability. In other words, we no longer think of the application of a word to an object as being yes or no. We think about it as being a likeliness, a likelihood, the probability of being applied. And as you might be not shocked to learn, an awful lot of words are vague. In fact, there's a school of linguists and philosophers who would say all words are vague. It's just a question of to what degree are they vague. So it has something to do with the shape of the distribution. But we don't need to believe that for the purposes of this talk. We just want to argue that at least the word is vague. That what is a word is a vague concept. And in particular, we have some help here from the philosophers again, specifically Wittgenstein, and said, wait a minute, a word is not just something that anybody makes up and says, okay, that's a word. I call this a blorg. That doesn't make blorg a word. A word has to be part of a language. It has to be recognized by other people. There's no private languages. So to be understood or to be a word, something has to be understood by speakers of that language. And so the probabilistic solution to the problem of what is a word is the probability that a speaker of that language will recognize it. Now, probability has its own set of problems. There's a whole argument about what do I mean by probability. So again, I'm not taking a position on that subject. If you are a frequentist, what you might mean by the probability of a word is that the number of people in the language who recognize it divided by the total number of speakers of the language. Or if you're a Bayesian, you might mean that it's the probability that an ideal speaker of the language or a model of the speaker of the language would recognize it. So I'm not taking sides or attempting to enforce any particular definition of probability. How does that probability view solve the problem? The way it solves it is in the following ways. First of all, as far as names are concerned, the vast majority of names are not recognized by very many speakers of the language. The few names that are words. For example, Christmas, that's a name, and it's a word. Prefixes and suffixes, as you stack them up, they make the word very hard to understand. So again, likelihood falls off. Compounds, now there's where there's an exception. For example, I pointed out air vent. Everybody knows what an air vent is. So that's a word. That's a word that's not in any dictionary. No dictionary has the word air vent in it, and I'll explain why in a minute. But it's a word, perfectly legitimate English language word. Again, rare words are not understood by definition. That's what you mean by a rare word, not understood by very many speakers. And derived forms, again, same problem as with prefixes and suffixes. You create words through chains of derivation where the likelihood of understanding falls off at each application of the generative principle. So how would we, assuming that probability is the right view to take on this, how are we going to estimate the probability of a word, that a string is a word? Well, one obvious idea is, which most people would use as a common sense solution to the problem, is you use a dictionary. If it's in a dictionary, a large dictionary, it's it's not as likely as if in a, say, a college level dictionary or a high school dictionary, but there's some argument. However, there's problems with that solution. It's not a crazy solution, but there are some problems. The first problem is historically illustrated by a historical fact that early dictionaries did not include common words. It was not viewed as being important to define common words, and it was expensive to print dictionaries. So the word "the," what's the point of wasting page space on defining common words? So they just weren't defined. Another example is air vent, which I've already mentioned, which does not occur in any dictionary. And the problem is that because dictionaries cost money to print, there has to be a reason to put a word in the dictionary. And in fact, essentially, a dictionary is an economic act. Including a word in a dictionary is an economic act. There's a cost-benefit analysis. And so the people who create dictionaries create them and put entries in them if they think it's likely that that entry will be of value to the purchaser of the dictionary. Now, that's not the same as saying that it's likely that they will be understood. You see, so there's a gap there. So it actually is an incorrect assumption that words that are easily understood will be in dictionaries. And in fact, the vast majority of words are not in dictionaries. So, okay, another idea. Let's use large corpora. There are many large corpora available. Just to illustrate kind of a jump that's occurred historically, the Usenet corpus was available relatively soon after Usenet ran. This was in the late 80s and the early 90s. And it had about 1 million distinct strings in about 1 billion instances. So that's all the Usenet traffic that was run through and captured and turned into that corpus. Google in 2006, early 2006, took a snapshot of the web and released to the Linguistic Data Consortium a corpus based on 1 trillion word instances. It contains over 10 million distinct strings. Now, there's an interesting detail, which I'll get back to later, about what the reason for this is. And the detail was that unlike the Usenet corpus, which simply had every word that had been sent through Usenet for whatever reason, the Google corpus only included words that had occurred at least 200 times on the web. And of course, Google did a lot of work there, by the way. First of all, they wanted to isolate English language web pages. And then it's non-trivial just to decide what is a word, because there's a lot of stuff going on a web page, like graphics and so on. So both of these corpora required a lot of work to get them down into some kind of a sensible list. However, there's already some problems just with any of these corpuses, corpora. One is the word countermeasure, just as an example. That word is in a college-level dictionary. It's in the 11th collegiate. But it's not in the Google corpus. And the reason it's not in the Google corpus is because it had less than 200 hits. Now, if you go to Google right now and look up countermeasure, you'll discover it has about 1,000 hits. But if you go and peer into those hits a little more carefully, there's several issues that will happen. One thing that will happen is the actual number of hits will shrink down to less than 200. But there are actually several other problems, which I'll get to. But let's take a look. We have a list of words from dictionaries. Let's take a look at how the Google corpus does against just that list. And what we'll discover is that there are a lot of college-level words that are not in the corpus. About 10%, 9% or so of the words that are in a college-level dictionary don't show up in the Google corpus. I give some examples there. Obviously, I'm not going to list all 10,000 examples. The really scary part, though, is the next fact, which is over 40% of words that show up in an unabridged dictionary aren't in the Google corpus. So missing an awful lot of words in that corpus. And the problem is the corpus cutoff of 200. Why did the team here at Google cut the corpus off at 200? Well, here's why. Boy, it's hard to read. I guess those are okay. You can read those last two lines, the blue ones. Okay. I'm giving you here a count of how many words there are by frequency in this corpus. Okay? So the frequency is the first column, the number of words is in the next column, and the ratio of one row to the previous row is the last column. The last two rows are extrapolations. In other words, I don't actually know how many words exist on the web in January of 2006. So I'm just using this ratio of 5 times. So in other words, for every factor of 10 that we cut down the frequency, we see a factor of 5 in the number of words. But it doesn't matter whether that number is exactly right or not. The point is that as soon as you get down to all the words defined in the entire web, strings defined in the entire web, you get somewhere between 2 and 300 million strings, different strings. Now, let's go back to our belief that there are 2 to 3 million words in English. So you've got 2 to 3 million words that you're trying to find in 200 to 300 million strings. About a 1% signal-to-noise ratio. Extremely hard to extract that information. And so what the team at Google did was very sensible. They just said, OK, we'll just cut it off at 200. Now, what happens roughly at that cutoff? Well, let's start with sampling. This can be, I'm showing here data just for a particular sample, which is the 2,747 strings that start with the 3 letters AIR. But I could have, this same pattern shows up pretty much everywhere, no matter what string you pick. So I've given samples of non-words, which is all the different ways, for example, that people can misspell aircraft. And an awful lot of that has to do with the layout of keys on the keyboard. And I also give samples of words that are not in the corpus. I mean, sorry, that are in the corpus but not in the dictionary. You'll see the first column, if you look under college level, you'll see a nice little peaked distribution where it starts off with, there's 3 words that have, let's see, is that 10 million hits? And then it goes up to 30-ish and then goes back down again. So that's a pretty nice distribution. It says, okay, the college level dictionary did pretty much what you thought it would do. It has all the really common words and a lot of sort of middle common words, and then it falls off. Then there's not much left over, which is what you would expect. And if I had put a high school level dictionary up here, you would have found the same thing, a peaked distribution, but the peak would have been at the higher hit rates. The unabridged is where the problem occurs, is that the unabridged starts off and then peaks but doesn't go back down again, because the cutoff cuts it off before it gets a chance to go back down. And in fact, the number of words just keeps going up. So the cutoff is essentially cutting off halfway through the distribution of words. And that's why there's more than 40% of words are not in the corpus. Okay? So a corpus by itself is not a very good solution to the problem of estimating the probability. It has several problems. What are the problems? Well, you can sort of see from what I showed you earlier, the problems of misspelling, obviously, the problem of names, the problems of spam, and there's a subtle problem that I didn't mention, which is the problem of use versus mention. In other words, many words that occur in a corpus are not actually being used in the corpus. They're just being mentioned in the corpus. As we all know, probably Google knows better than anybody, there's an enormous sort of arms race going on with trying to get people to go to your website. And one of the ways to do that is to try to overcome Bayesian filtering. And one of the ways to do that is to try to include words that are uncommon. Well, and what does that mean? Well, it means words that are not really being used on the site. They're just being mentioned on the site. So there's an enormous kind of distortion. By the way, there's a similar distortion that's occurred through the creation of the use of spell checkers. In the early days of email and in the very early days of the web, before a lot of use of spell checkers was integrated into word processors, there were many words that were misspelled more often than they were correctly spelled. An example is the word desiccated. That word in the old days was misspelled more often than it was correctly spelled. But because of spell checkers now being essentially ubiquitous, you'll find that now the correct spelling of desiccated does in fact dominate over the incorrect spelling. So at any rate, the point is that the corpora by themselves are not going to be enough to solve the problem of estimating the probability of a word, the string is a word. So what we've decided to do in the project is to try to combine two approaches, essentially under the general theory of modeling human understanding. And the two approaches are a Bayesian model of word understanding, which neuroscience gives us some reason to believe is how the brain works. That's a whole long discussion, which I'm not going to bore you with, but there's just results from neuroscience that makes us fairly confident that the Bayesian inference is how the brain works. And there are also other theoretical reasons to believe that. And the second is a generative model of word formation, which comes from linguistics. In other words, words are not formed randomly. Words are formed for reasons, historical reasons. For example, we talked about the word amitular, which I'll get to in a sec. So let's take an example of a Bayesian model of word understanding. We look on the decision about of computing the probability of the word Shanghaiings, the string Shanghaiings being a word, as simply an example of Bayesian inference. And each step of the inference has a probability. The probabilities come from observed ratios of occurrences of related cases or similar cases, which of course is the tricky part. What do we mean by similar case? But nonetheless, it's a fairly straightforward application of Bayesian inference, and does rely on the corpus to give us some of that information. The generative model of word formation comes from essentially from linguistics, from the information that's largely from information that's already in dictionaries, together with information that linguists know very well. So things like how parallelism works, how, of course, etymology, how sounds change, how spelling change, and so on over time. And as I gave an example earlier, we can start with the parallelism between avunculus and amata and get to the words avuncular and amitular. And we can predict that that's where the language will land. And in fact, we have some reason to believe that. So by combining these two together, we create an iterative approach. In other words, you're working outward from the dictionary using the linguistic information, and you're working inward from the corpus using Bayesian inferencing. The reason I like to sometimes be firing down from the height, so I like to believe that this is going to work. There's some underlying reason why this program will work. And the reason is because there's an underlying process that's common to the two things. And namely, there's a thing called Zipf's law, which linguists identified a long time ago for the distribution of words in word usage in pretty much any sample. And it follows a power law. But we now know that these power laws come out or are a result from scale-free underlying processes. Similarly, we now know something about how the brain works, and that the brain has the neuronal connections in the brain are scale-free. It creates a scale-free network of axons. So we have reasons to believe that these two linguistic laws together with the Bayesian laws are actually going to work together to create a stable solution to the problem. And we also have the evidence that language exists, which makes us feel pretty confident that there is something that we can fall back on. So at any rate, in conclusion, the goal of my program, or of the program that the people who are working on this project have adopted, is that what we're going to produce is not really a list. It's not a list of words. What it is, it's a process which has various assumptions in it, parameters such as probabilities and rules. And from a given set of rules and a given set of parameters, you can assess the likelihood that any given string is a word. And then you're free to make your own choice and choose to change one of the parameters or delete or add one of the rules. And out of that, you'll get, of course, a slightly different probability assignment. But ultimately, the idea would be to go in and say, OK, look, given these set of plausible assumptions, give me a list of words sort of in decreasing probability. And the idea would be the words high up on the list would be obvious words, common words, and the words later on the list would be more and more obscure words. And at some point, you would say, let's say if you're the International Scrabble Association, you would say, OK, we're going to cut off at this point right here. Because the way they work right now is they cut off based on the inclusion in various dictionaries. And there's an awful lot of words that aren't, as I've already said, that aren't included in dictionaries that should be legal for Scrabble play. OK, so that's the end. Any questions? Yes?
At the very beginning, there are different forms of the word, and perhaps, or the initial starting area that has ones or two words, or like
2 words. Yeah. You almost always, let me repeat the question. The question was, if you have different forms of word like cat and cats, the plural, do you consider that 1 word or 2 words? And for the purposes of this project, we're considering that 2 words. And the reason for that is because there's some ways to generate inflected forms and other forms of words, like transitioning from, as I mentioned, from a gerund to a noun, that aren't 100% going to be accepted. And so it's just a simpler process to assume that all movements from one form to another have some likelihood, less than, and move from a noun like cat to a noun like, plural like cats is obviously going to have a very high likelihood. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
You had your list of problems at the beginning, from formations. Why isn't there a problem with misspelling?
Okay, so the question was, amongst the problems that I mentioned at the beginning, I didn't list misspellings as a problem. Why didn't I? And the answer to your question is, what I was trying to say in that earlier list was things that are specific, are not specific to dictionaries or corpuses or so on. But you're right, the problem of misspellings is a big problem for corpus linguistics. And in fact, if you go back to that slide where I was showing you all the misspellings of the word aircraft, it's useful, it would be useful to go back to the original source material and fix those misspellings because those misspellings are telling, there's actual information in all, not so much in the misspellings, but in the text surrounding the misspelling where the person accidentally typed the wrong word. And if you fix that, you might be able to get some meaning extracted from that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get.
There's a bigger problem because you have an assumption in what you said that at some point misspellings become words. I could argue that ervent is a misspelling, so it shouldn't be in dictionary.
Right. Okay, so the question is, I'm going to rephrase your question. Aren't the lexicographers really right in keeping ervent out of a dictionary, because isn't ervent really a misspelling of a either hyphenated term or an open compound? And my answer to that is it depends upon, again, everything depends upon everything else. So it depends upon how often it's used. Is ervent used in a closed-up way frequently enough to generate, to decide that, well, that's moved over the hurdle to being a word? Because there are an awful lot of binomial terms, just two-word phrases, that don't appear closed up at all, or very infrequently. And so there is some sort of and that's an example of where I said earlier, our conclusion is, we're not trying to come up with a list. We're trying to come up with a process that will create a probability estimate. And one of the questions that we would have is, how do we decide when is a binomial term turned into a closed compound and when? And however, I want to say that since I know a lot of lexicographers, I don't think the average lexicographer would say that ervent is not a word. I think he would say, ervent's not in the dictionary because its meaning is obvious. That's not the same thing as saying it's not a word.
One last question that's directly related, but you probably know the answer. Back 8 or 10 years ago, when people would use this word, any dictionary you look up the word millennium, and it said it had 2 N's. And suddenly, Microsoft spell checker said it was okay with 1 N. Do you have any why that is?
I don't know why that particular word. Okay, the question was, why did the Microsoft spell checker decide about 10 years ago or so that the word millennium could be correctly spelled with 1 N? And it may be because there was some Japanese auto manufacturer that came out with a car with the word named millennium with only 1 N in millennium. And they decided, oh, well, we throw in the towel at that point, But there's a lot of, so I don't know whether they had any rationality behind that or not. I've heard, similarly, as I mentioned, the word desiccated, when I point out to people that the word desiccated for a long time was spelled more incorrectly, more often it was spelled correctly, some people's natural instinct is to say, well, wait a minute. In that case, the incorrect spelling is the correct spelling. Because if something's spelled more, but there's reasons I would want to argue with that by pointing out that that's putting too much emphasis on only one aspect of what it takes to form a word. There are a lot of other reasons why desiccated is spelled the way it is that have to do with its etymology. And it comes from a Latin word which happens to be spelled the way it is, and that's why that word is spelled the way it is. And if you just rely on corpus linguistics for deciding what is the correct spelling of something, you'll get an awful lot of weird results. However, I now don't have to make that argument anymore, because now it's spelled more often correctly than incorrectly. So, yes?
Then in that case, the amitular case, also, well, that allowing it, because people keep pointing it, maybe yes, is that thing.
Amitular, amitular is I picked because it's a particularly thorny case. The argument that it should be a word is somewhat subtle, but I don't think and I like the subtlety of this argument, because I don't like arguments that are sort of too broad and too sledgehammery. Here's why, as I've already said, why it's subtle. It's subtle because it's actually, if you say, well, it's valid from the etymological point of view, it's actually not valid from an etymological point of view. It's not the correct inflection of the Latin term. So there's something about the etymology, but there's also something about the parallelism with another word. And there's also something about it filling a hole in the language, which is why it keeps getting invented over and over again. So what I would like to argue is, if you don't have a system that takes into account all of those factors and actually comes out at the end and says, darn it, amitular, that's a word, then you haven't really captured the process that goes on, and you have to keep working on it until you do have that system. Now, however, just to point out another somewhat subtle one of the most frequently misspelled words is familiar. And it's one of the top 10 misspelled words because it's spelled in parallel with similar. So what happens is they want the ending of those two words, people who are misspelling it, want the ending to be the same. So they either misspell similar or they misspell familiar. And you could argue, well, wait a minute. On the one hand, you're saying parallelism matters, and on the other hand, you're saying it doesn't matter. And I'm saying, you know what? That's true. I'm saying it's complicated and it's not easy to figure out in what cases it matters and what cases it doesn't matter. So I guess I'm saying, as the Greeks said, moderation in all things. We have to have a balanced approach to the problem. It has to combine these various influences. And in the end of the day, we don't want to be trying to legislate against, and this is the problem with many sort of artificial language and spelling reform movements. People try to legislate against what's actually going on out there, which really isn't what our job is. Our job is to figure out what's going on and figure out how to encode that in a series of, it's science after all, it's basically science. Yes?
The number of words in other languages, how does that compare to the number of words?
Frankly, I don't know the question was, how does the word in other languages compare to the number of words in English? I think English has a much larger lexicon than other languages, but I have not studied other languages, and I don't know. And in particular, it may be that Chinese, for example, has an enormous word hoard that I'm just unaware of. So I just don't know the answer to that. Yes?
So it seems like just in this room, we've got people with different opinions about what's a word, what's not. You talked about the process of coming up with rules for word formation. People who are working on this, do they get into a massive screen fest about what's a valid rule, what's not?
Well, the question was, do people who are working on this project get into very big arguments about what's a word and what isn't a word? And the answer would be yes, if what we were trying to do is have it like the definitive list that says this is what the word is, this is a word or this is not a word. And so very early on in the project, we decided that the only rational approach to it was to say, look, let's just get a system set up where you can change the assumptions. If you don't like that assumption, you can change the assumption. But the thing that still makes it more than just making up your own list is that if we agree that this is the basic process that's going, then sometimes you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you think this is the rule here and it gives you a result over there that differs from what your instinct is, that's very elucidating. You learn something from the process of doing it. So there's a consistency that compressing it down to a set of rules forces on you that otherwise you wouldn't really know. So it's like science. You try to simplify down to a set of rules and processes that will generate the language that most people would agree. Now, of course, no two speakers of English will agree completely on whether everything is or isn't a word. So it's actually a feature of the system. You want it to be able to incorporate those distinctions. You want to be able to say, yeah, here's why some people think this is a word and other people don't. More questions? Yes?
At the very beginning, and I might have missed the explanation of this, you had a go saying many times the number of 46. Is that, I don't know where that comes from. Is that intuition? Is that actual measurement or what?
Okay, well, where Gove got the number was from his knowledge of the way in which Merriam-Webster created the New International Dictionary. In other words, he had access to the process of deciding whether something gets in the dictionary or doesn't get in the dictionary. And so he was able to say, look, we've done a reading and marking program where we've gone and looked at, well, one thing you learn from this, one takeaway from this is, it's not enough just to go to a very large corpus because you won't get the words. You have to do something more than that. And so lexicographers have known that forever. And what lexicographers do is they do a program called reading and marking, where they, science has been defined to be the process of torturing nature for her secrets. And so reading and marking is a little bit like that. You purposely go out and try to read stuff that you know is going to have different words in it, unusual words, especially journals in certain languages and certain areas and so on. So it's very much like the process of creating an encyclopedia or anything. You have to consciously go out and search out these words. So but Gove is sort of sitting at the top of that food chain, so he sees these words as they come through day after day after day for months and years. And so he gets in his mind, he basically knows, I know how many words I could put in versus how many words I did put in. And so when he says many times, whether that means 4 or 6 or some number like that, I take him to know what he's talking about. But that's really the correct ratio between the real number of words in English and the words that are in the dictionary. Yes?
Can we apply your word to Google's corpus and instead of cutting off at 200, use more intelligent rules and say, here's a list of 10 million words? Or,
So the question is, could we apply this work to the Google corpus and do better than just cutting off at 200 to do sort of, here's the good 10 million words or the good 2 million words or something? And the answer obviously is yes. And the reason I'm here talking to you guys today is because I would like to work with the people on the team, would like to work with the people at Google to try to improve the Google corpus, and who knows, as I already mentioned, one idea, which is the spelling, improving. There's been around for a long time, spell checkers, and they're very, in the one that is used in Microsoft, because I know where that one came from, there's a small number of rules, like I think 20 or so rules that it applies, and they have to do with the keyboard layout and so on. Stuff like that could be done very efficiently, computationally, and could greatly improve this signal-to-noise ratio in the Google corpus. So yes, there's an awful lot of things that can be done. We're just at the beginning of learning of this stuff, and I think the people on the team would love to work with Google to try to improve that work. More questions? Okay, thank you.